sex trafficking, racism, sexism, child sexual abuse, trauma, and their unjust handling in the criminal justice system. These lived experiences overlap in the story of Cyntoia Brown, a woman whose journey and plight from trauma exposes our very own prejudices, deeply ingrained and reflected in our institutions and day-to-day lives. One victim carried the brunt of violence, abuse, and condemnation before her case was illuminated in the eyes of the media and society as the severe mishandling of justice that it was. Welcome to my media project in the form of a video essay / TED Talk, in which I will tackle an analysis of a discriminatory case in the United States criminal justice system. To analyze Cyntoia Brown's grueling situation effectively enough while taking into consideration the various intersections working to oppress her, I honed in on one docuseries revolving around her imprisonment at the age of 16 and the attempts of gaining her liberation. PBS's Sentencing Children: Cyntoia's Story presents us with 7 episodes that expose the process of her indictment and conviction while following the difficult steps requiring the reopening of her case to create long-standing change in the criminal sentencing of children in the state of Tennessee. This film's treatment of the unjust criminalization of a young black victim of sexual abuse mimics the ambiguity of the ways her case was framed to the general public. The scenes included are in the series for a reason, and I plan on picking apart what we observe from the episodes while primarily focusing on the very crucial things they leave out. So to start us off, let's take a gander at some of what the first episode shows us.
I thought he was reaching for a gun, so I'm like, oh, shit. You know what I'm saying? That's what he's done. He's gonna murder me or rape me or something.
Yeah. And then what did you do?
I shot him. And it's like all these thoughts all of a sudden rushed in my head. What have I done? What am I doing? What just happened? He said that I was slipping and that I was starting to become a slouch, that I needed to get out and get on my grind and get some money.
What's this guy cut? What's his real name?
Gary and McLean. I remember one time, the first time he did something to me is when he choked me and I passed out. Because he said I thought he was a joke.
Did you ever have sex with the guys?
When I cut with a gun up to me, I did.
Did he have sex with you too?
Yeah, he had sex with me. Sometimes I don't want to have sex with him. He'd still me. I'd be crying and everything.
So how come you stayed with him?
You're not listening. I made him money. He wasn't gonna let me go nowhere. He's told me he'd kill me. He knows where my mom lives. And I know the dude choked me till I almost passed out. He's not afraid to kill me.
And this brings us to our first subject. What's missing? First off, they failed to talk about race. Although Cyntoia is mixed, she passes for black, she presents as black, and that's a big reason as to why she was so quickly criminalized in the way that she was. There is also a great race disproportionality in the foster system and the child welfare system, which she went through, and this disproportionality makes sense considering the variety of social hierarchies created and reinforced that line up against her. Those in lower socioeconomic classes with higher rates of impoverishment are disproportionately people of color. Women in impoverished areas are more susceptible to be targets of sex trafficking, and generally speaking, intimate partner violence and domestic violence are more widespread problems among their homes as well. Applying this knowledge to Cyntoia, we know that she lived with her biological parents for some time, a household in which her father was abusive and was eventually put up for adoption. Another thing that this series did not focus on enough was her age. We have to emphasize her age a lot. She was a minor, and one of the first alarming factors that we see here, and that ultimately led to her conviction and 51-year sentence, was that she was tried as an adult when she was only 16. We see her in the clips as very collected and mature for her age, which is pretty common in cases where children are exposed to adult problems way too early in life. In cases of child sexual abuse, it's also very important to note that it is impossible for children to give consent, a significant point brought up by Cyntoia in her literature. One must have both knowledge and authority to properly consent, and those are void in these instances. And this made me wonder, does this tie in with race, like her perception of being older than she really is? And I looked into it and found that black female children are generally seen as less innocent and even less feminine than white female children. There is this concept of adultification that follows young black girls starting at a very early age, as well as with young black males. In the cases of the males, police violence against them is more justified. With females, stereotypes such as them being overly loud are imbued with adult-like aspirations and are, in turn, perceived as a threat to a lot of white people. In Rebecca Epstein's work, she presented a study that recorded that teachers describe black girls in school as exhibiting more mature behavior socially, just not quite academically. They are socially sophisticated and even controlling at a young age, according to those teachers. We also have to take into account the hypersexualization black girls face as well, with some of this perception rooted in them maturing physically at a faster rate than white girls. Their sexualization and adultification can both be traced back to slavery, as black people were commonly put to work as soon as they could walk, leading to their perception as older than their actual age or like incomparable to white people's development. And black girl slaves also commonly faced sexual harassment because of this throughout their entire lives. White children generally enjoy more legal protections in cases such as these, while black youth's childlike behavior is responded to more punitively and with suspicion. Now, let's consider Cyntoia's abusive past and present at the time that she shot Johnny Allen. Cyntoia serves as a prime example of child sex trafficking and the disproportionate susceptibility of girls of color to sex trafficking. Marcus Anthony details that liberals recognize now, for the most part, that the rate of incarceration of men of color is very high. But what is less talked about is the criminalization of girls and women of color that have been trafficked. Their intersection of exploitation meets at the sexualization due to their gender and their criminalization because of their race. Circumstances were detailed in her interview, where Cyntoia describes being threatened at gunpoint by the man that sold her to other men and raped her himself on multiple occasions, his name being Cutthroat. Let's see now how she describes the events of how the night made her feel and what kind of response that triggered within her while she was with Johnny Allen.
He didn't want to go to the hotel. He said that he wanted to go to his house because there was no one there. That time he was just finished telling me about his accomplishments and saying how that he used to be in the Army and that he was a sharpshooter in the Army. And then he had told me how a lot of women want him for his money and that he wanted someone to make love with him with desire.
Okay. Did you see any guns in the house?
Yes, I seen 2 shotguns downstairs, and he showed me a chrome gun with a black handle.
Do you tend to be a nervous person?
Yeah.
Was there anything that made you especially nervous that night?
Just how he was acting, just how he talked. It's like the way he talked, how he was just so important and stuff. And then me, I look at myself, who am I? Who am I to him? It's like, then he talks about the guns and stuff. If he does something to me, I'm sitting here thinking, what can I do?
You sat on the couch and watched TV with him. You felt comfortable doing that. You got in the bed and at least one time went to sleep while he was there. You felt comfortable doing that.
I never went to sleep. He just grabbed me like in between my legs, like he just grabbed it real hard. And he just gave me this look. It was like a very fierce look. And it just sent these chills up my spine. I'm thinking he's gonna hit me or do something like that. But then he rolls over and reaches, like he's reaching to the side of the bed or something. So I'm thinking, no, he's not finna hit me. He's finna get a gun.
So I'm just wondering, with all this that she's shared, why was self-defense never mentioned? Like, she said she was defending herself in court, but her lawyers weren't exposed in this documentary as really putting on a case for self-defense. Just imagining if a man is taking you to his house, isolated from anywhere else, anywhere you're familiar with, because he wants to be isolated from society, all the while he's talking about his gun collection. I feel like her fears of being in grave danger were justified. I definitely would be very terrified. The video's aim seems to pull attention only toward the fact that children are too young to understand the finality of their actions, rather than on her emotions and her experiences and why those emotions were there, considering her very traumatic history. Now for what this documentary did include. a lot of the stuff that they did actually focus on feeds into her negative portrayal that imprisoned her in the first place. In the first 2 minutes of the episode, they emphasize psychiatric illness on her mother's side of the family. Though they don't account for this, there is obviously intergenerational trauma present. So let's take a look at her mother detailing her history.
Biological mother side of the family is extremely heavily loaded with psychiatric disorders.
Bipolar, personality disorder, suicidal, manic depressive, which is an guarded condition. At times I've had homicidal thoughts for people that have hurt me. I've been raped, and I've always, wanted to do things to them for hurting me.
This emphasis on her mother's mental history reduces the scope of blame for the ordeal on Cyntoia's inherent biology, rather than taking into account the effects she endured at the hands of her abusive situation that hold a lasting impact, without a doubt. The only time they so much as hinted at Cyntoia's trauma was when they asked if she tends to be a nervous person, to which she replied, yes. People with PTSD tend to experience hyperarousal of things around them, as well as recurring intrusion of memories of the past trauma. It doesn't register in the brain that the traumatic experience is over. The docuseries also made sure to include the question that was asked to her in an interview room, so how come you stayed with him? This harmful mentality correlates directly with victim blaming, a common cultural phenomenon that translates into the legislative process of trying women that were in abusive situations and experienced intimate partner violence. Now for her appeal, what do they emphasize there after 13 years of imprisonment? Well, they did bring up her mental health very briefly. So they mentioned the trauma, the sexual abuse, physical abuse, but it was literally just to justify reasons as to why she deserves an appeal. They didn't bother explaining how those may have affected her or played into her response the night that she defended herself from Johnny Allen. Her PTSD is still undermined and left to the audience to infer past its brief mention. Another thing I'm going to bring up is that she seemed pretty unaffected during her initial interviews following her arrest, which is a clear side effect of trauma. Let's take another look at these interviews and note how the camera focuses in on her face specifically more than anything else.
What else did he do to you?
He talked real bad to me and jacked me up. He pulled me by my hair and dragged me and stuff. He put guns up me, told me to strap and stuff like that, getting at it with other people.
According to Judith Lewis Herman, a traumatized person can either experience intense emotion with little or no memory of the event or offense that occurred, or they may be able to recount every detail with seemingly no emotion, which is the case that we see with Cyntoia. Her trauma response definitely contributed to the court and her interviewers' assumptions that she has no remorse for what she did. And this feeds into that stereotype that Black people are hardened criminals when in fact they are just more likely to have experienced a life of trauma than a white person would in your average white suburban household. And because we see this as a norm, we refuse to acknowledge how these differences of just status, of location, of community may play out in people's lives and mental health and how it would affect those. A lot of screen time went into these interviews, with the camera zooming in very closely on her face as she held a stoic expression while describing her circumstances. This point also brings us to the double standard that there is with women when they are testifying their experiences. It's either that they are too emotional or not emotional enough, and that definitely affects how courts and a jury would see them and see their stories as valid or not. The film's ultimate motive is to bring awareness to the necessity of reform with the juvenile justice laws, using Cyntoia's case as a prime example as to why there needs to be reform. But I find that it would have been more effective had the docuseries aimed to explain more of why the justice system failed her and her specific case in the way it had, taking a more intersectional approach that investigated more her background, why she ended up in the situation she did. And again, that emphasized it was not her fault. And that brings us to ask, what should have been done in response to Cyntoia's case? Because she didn't get the chance to be acknowledged or recognized as a victim, like at all. They did not treat her as a victim. They did not offer her any sympathy, anything. They just criminalized her this entire time. So there's definitely a sort of guarantee that a white girl her age would benefit from that was denied from Cyntoia from the very beginning and resulted in a very different outcome and very different treatment in the whole process. This aspect of her criminalization in absence of victimization is also shown in the absence of mention of her abuser's fate. Cutthroat was specifically named by Cyntoia multiple times and his actions detailed, but his own conviction was never once noted in the series. We don't even know anything of his arrest or trial, and this only helps to build a framework for establishing Cyntoia as a criminal rather than the victim. Today, Cyntoia has been granted clemency as of last year and is free after over 13 years behind bars, thankfully. I hope at least now she can be granted proper victim advocacy support and for her case to be accepted by everyone nationwide as a severe injustice it was against a poor Black woman, and that this will inspire a new mental framework that analyzes these kinds of cases differently and seeing how various intersections criminalize Black people unfairly. Thank you for listening. This is Andra Steikus signing out.